Joining us now is John Wood, former senior investigative counsel of the January 6th investigation. Mr. Wood, good to see you. Thank you for being with us tonight. Thanks for taking time.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Let's talk about Sarah Matthews first. What do you think we expect to hear from her if, in fact, she does turn out to be a witness next week?
Yeah, so I expect her to be a very credible witness. She's very young, but she had an important role within the White House. I led the interview, as you said, conducted by the staff, and I found her to be very credible. So I think she's going to help fill in some of the gaps in the testimony that you've heard so far. And I think you're going to really hear a focus on the days leading up to January 6th and then really the minute by minute of January 6th. Itself. It may not be as explosive as what we heard from Cassidy Hutchinson, but each of these hearings, I think, is going to provide additional information that the American people have not heard yet.
So the committee had heard from Pat Cipollone in what was called an informal interview, and then the Cassidy Hutchinson stuff came out. What you realized out of that and other stories that we keep getting is that Pat Cipollone was central to a lot of stuff. He was around. And by the way, his testimony may lead him to, for people to think of him as being on the right side of history, given what he kept arguing. But he's agreed now to testify in front of the committee on Friday. I'm assuming that's a product of Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony because so many references were made to him and things he said and legal exposure that he was worried about.
So I think it's a combination of things. I think there was weeks of back and forth between the committee and Mr. Cipollone's lawyers to try to get him in and talk on the record, and discussions and negotiations about possible accommodations, because I think Mr. Cipollone, for some of the information he has legitimate privilege concerns, but a lot of the information he has is clearly not privileged. And so it was really important that he eventually end up testifying before the committee on the record and videotaped so the American people can see it. And I'm really glad to see that that's coming together this Friday so that hopefully the committee will show some of the key clips of that interview during the hearing next week. So it's important that the American people hear from him. And you're right about the Cassidy Hutchinson point. I think one of the reasons why Mr. Cipollone's testimony is going to be so important is on some of the things that Cassidy Hutchinson testified about, Mr. Cipollone was in the room, and he will be able to either corroborate or reject some of the testimony she made. And which one of those he does will be very important in telling us how credible Cassidy Hutchinson was, because to me, she appeared very credible.
One of the things she said about Pat Cipollone was that he'd come to her and said, don't let this happen. Don't let them go to the Capitol. We'll be charged with every crime imaginable. Does that statement, if it holds to be true, does that take away the executive privilege or any kind of privilege that Cipollone has? Because obviously lawyers can't be involved in the commission of crimes. If a lawyer warns about the potential commission of a crime, is that privileged information, or can he testify to that?
So I would say that the conversation that he had with her probably is not privileged to begin with. I don't think you have to find an exception. The direct communications that he may have had with the president. So hypothetically, if he said, Mr. President, you should not go to the Capitol because here are the reasons why it would be illegal, I think that might be privileged. But him just saying to another staffer that he thinks it might violate every law imaginable, I don't think that that itself is privileged. So the executive privilege has some gray areas, but at its core is that senior staff should be able to give candid advice to the president without it becoming public. But I think the comments that Mr. Cipollone may have made to somebody like Cassidy Hutchinson probably are not privileged.
In previous hearings, however, the committee has cited several instances in which Pat Cipollone allegedly did raise legal concerns over Trump's actions before and during January 6th. I guess it's going to be important for the committee to get him on the record confirming or denying specific statements that he's said to have made in the presence of his White House colleagues, like the one we were just discussing.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think you said earlier that Pat Cipollone may turn out to be on the right side of history, and I think he will. I think from everything that I've seen, he was one of the good guys here in that he tried to stop President Trump, and in some cases did stop President Trump from doing some things that could have been really harmful to the country. So, I've heard other people say that he could be the John Dean of this investigation, but he's different from John Dean in a very important respect, which is John Dean was actually involved in some of the wrongdoing. Here, I haven't seen any evidence that Pat Cipollone was involved in any of the wrongdoing. In fact, he tried to stop it. But he is similar to John Dean in the sense that not only does he have the same position of White House counsel, but he was right there in the room when so many of these conversations took place. So he could turn out to be a really central witness to this whole investigation.
John, you've had a really good seat to these hearings. You've been right in them. What's the biggest revelation out of the hearing so far for you?
So, I think the biggest revelation in general is just how close we came to having a constitutional crisis that was even worse than the one that we had on January 6th, believe it or not. So January 6th was absolutely horrible, both in terms of what it meant for the functioning of our government and, of course, for the people who were injured or killed. But it actually could have been far worse, and our democracy is very fragile. And there were some things that a few people, in these cases Republicans, who were serving Donald Trump and were appointed by Donald Trump, were able to stop Donald Trump from doing that could have made it even worse than it was. So the pressure that he tried to put on the Department of Justice ultimately was unsuccessful because his Justice Department senior officials threatened to quit. He tried to place pressure on state officials who were Republicans, and they stood up to him and said, Mr. President, we voted for you, but we can't change the outcome of the election. So these are the kinds of things. And, of course, the vice president himself saying no to the president, saying that he would not change the outcome of the election. In each of those examples, our system held, but just barely. And our system is very fragile. So I think that's the key takeaway.